Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Arrival. Vincent Murphy stood at the window of his modest two-story house, watching the social worker's car disappear down Maple Street. In the silence that followed, he could hear the soft whimpering from the living room where 8-year-old Tommy sat clutching a worn teddy bear, his only remaining possession from a life that had been shattered 2 weeks ago. Vince had built his reputation as a security consultant through 15 years of methodical precision, first in the Army and then in the private sector. At 42, his weathered face and calculating gray eyes reflected a man who solved problems with surgical efficiency. But standing there, looking at his deceased brother's son, he felt something crack inside his chest. "Hey there, soldier," Vince said, using the nickname he'd given Tommy during their infrequent visits. The boy looked up with red-rimmed eyes that reminded Vince painfully of his brother Mike. "You remember Aunt Patty?" Patricia Murphy emerged from the kitchen, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing the pale blue scrubs that marked her profession as a registered nurse. At 38, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that had first caught Vince's attention 12 years ago at a Veterans Hospital charity event. She'd been volunteering there, he'd been recovering from shrapnel wounds, and their courtship had been built on her gentle care and his grateful devotion. "Of course he remembers me," Patty said, settling beside Tommy with practiced ease. "We're going to take real good care of you, sweetheart. Your Uncle Vince has to travel for work sometimes, but I'll be right here. I work nights at the hospital, so we'll have lots of time together during the day." Tommy nodded silently, and Vince felt that familiar surge of gratitude for his wife's nurturing nature. They'd never been able to have children of their own, a source of quiet grief that had only strengthened their bond. Now, fate had given them a chance to be parents, albeit under the most tragic circumstances. "I've already talked to Mrs. Henderson next door," Patty continued, her voice soft and reassuring. "She's retired and loves children. She'll check on you when I'm at work, and she's got emergency contacts for both your uncle and me." Over the next few days, Vince watched his wife transform their spare bedroom into a child's sanctuary. She painted the walls a cheerful blue, assembled a race car bed, and filled the shelves with toys and books. Her dedication reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her, the way she threw herself completely into caring for others. But as the first week passed, Vince began noticing changes in Tommy that troubled him. The boy, who had been eating ravenously during his first days with them, perhaps making up for the chaos of the past month, began picking at his food. He complained of stomach aches and seemed constantly tired, napping far more than seemed normal for an active 8-year-old. "Maybe it's the stress," Patty suggested when Vince expressed concern. "He's been through tremendous trauma. Children process grief differently than adults. Give him time." Vince wanted to believe her. As someone who'd witnessed the effects of trauma firsthand, he understood that grief could manifest in unexpected ways. But his training in threat assessment made him naturally suspicious of coincidences. Tommy had been healthy during the brief time they'd cared for him immediately after the funeral. The decline had begun only after they'd settled into a routine. "I think we should take him to a doctor," Vince said one evening as they watched Tommy struggle to finish half a sandwich. "I am a medical professional, honey," Patty replied, though not unkindly. "I've been monitoring his symptoms. He doesn't have a fever, his color is good, and he's still gaining weight overall. Sometimes children's appetites fluctuate when they're adjusting to new environments." Still, something gnawed at Vince's instincts. He'd learned in the military never to ignore that persistent voice that whispered warnings. Too many good soldiers had died because someone had dismissed their gut feelings as paranoia. That weekend, while Patty worked a double shift at the hospital, Vince spent quality time with Tommy, taking him to the local park and arcade. Away from the house, the boy seemed to perk up significantly. His energy returned. He laughed at Vince's terrible jokes, and he devoured an entire pizza at lunch. "I like it better when it's just us," Tommy said unexpectedly as they walked home. "Aunt Patty is nice, but she makes me feel sleepy." The comment hit Vince like a cold blade between the ribs. He knelt down to Tommy's level, studying the boy's face carefully. "What do you mean, Sleepy?" "After she gives me my vitamins," Tommy explained matter-of-factly. "She says they're special ones to help me grow big and strong like you. But they make me want to take naps all the time." Vince's blood pressure spiked. Neither he nor Patty had discussed vitamins for Tommy. As far as he knew, the boy was taking no medications at all. "Tommy," he said carefully, "can you show me these vitamins when we get home?" But when they returned to the house, Patty was already there, having left work early with a headache. She greeted them with warm hugs and immediately began preparing Tommy's afternoon snack, a routine that Vince now realized he'd never actually witnessed. That night, as Patty slept beside him, Vince stared at the ceiling and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would install a security camera in the kitchen. He told himself it was just to put his mind at ease, to prove that his suspicious nature was getting the better of him. He had no idea that the footage he was about to capture would reveal a betrayal so profound that it would transform him from a protective husband into something far more dangerous. Chapter 2: The Hidden Truth. Vince spent Monday morning at his office, ostensibly reviewing security protocols for a new client, but actually researching the most sophisticated surveillance equipment money could buy. His company, Murphy Security Consulting, specialized in corporate espionage prevention, which meant he had access to military-grade technology that most people couldn't even imagine. He selected a pinhole camera system so advanced that it could record in 4K resolution while being virtually undetectable. The lens was smaller than a pencil eraser and could be hidden inside something as innocuous as a smoke detector. More importantly, it transmitted directly to his encrypted server, meaning he could monitor the feed remotely from his phone. By Tuesday afternoon, the system was installed and operational. Vince had positioned cameras in the kitchen, living room, and Tommy's bedroom, telling himself that he was simply being thorough. If Tommy was having some kind of medical episode, the footage might help doctors identify patterns they couldn't see otherwise. The first day's recordings showed nothing unusual. Patty prepared Tommy's breakfast and lunch with her typical care, helped him with homework, and read him stories before his nap. Vince felt foolish for suspecting his wife of what exactly? He wasn't even sure what he'd been afraid of finding. But on Thursday morning, everything changed. Vince was in a client meeting when his phone buzzed with a motion alert from the kitchen camera. He glanced at it absently, expecting to see Patty preparing lunch. Instead, he watched his wife remove a small brown bottle from her purse and carefully measure several drops of clear liquid into Tommy's orange juice. The bottle was unmarked, and Patty handled it with the kind of careful precision she used when administering medications at the hospital. But Tommy wasn't supposed to be on any medications. Vince had specifically asked about this during their conversations with the social worker. His hands shaking slightly, Vince excused himself from the meeting and found a private office where he could review the footage more carefully. He watched his wife stir the doctored juice, then call Tommy in for lunch. The boy drank it obediently, and within 20 minutes, he was struggling to keep his eyes open. "Just a little nap, sweetheart." Patty's voice came through clearly on the audio. "You'll feel better when you wake up." Vince's military training kicked in, suppressing the emotional turmoil and focusing his mind on intelligence gathering. He needed more information before he could act. Whatever Patty was doing, she was being careful and methodical about it. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a pattern. Over the next week, Vince documented everything. Patty administered the unknown substance daily, always when she thought she was unobserved. Sometimes it went into Tommy's juice, sometimes into his soup, and once into a glass of chocolate milk. The dosage seemed carefully calculated, enough to make the boy drowsy and lethargic, but not enough to cause obvious symptoms that would trigger a hospital visit. But the most disturbing discovery came on the following Tuesday. Vince was reviewing footage from the previous evening when he caught something that made his blood freeze. After putting Tommy to bed, Patty had made a phone call. "It's working perfectly," she said, her voice low but clear on the recording. "He's weak and tired all the time now, but not sick enough to arouse suspicion. Vince thinks it's just grief and adjustment." There was a pause as she listened to whoever was on the other end. I know we have to be patient, she continued. But the policy is substantial, and I've been very careful about the documentation. A child his age, with the trauma he's experienced, when it happens, it'll look completely natural. Vince felt the room spinning around him. Policy? Documentation? His wife was talking about Tommy, as if he were some kind of investment. Yes, I miss you too, Patty said, her voice taking on a different tone entirely. But we can't risk Vince getting suspicious. He's trained to notice things, and he's already asking questions about Tommy's health. We just need a few more weeks, and then we can be together properly. The call ended, and Vince watched his wife check her appearance in the hallway mirror before climbing the stairs to their bedroom, where she would lie down next to him and pretend to be the loving, caring woman he'd married. Vince sat in his office until dawn, reviewing the footage again and again, trying to find some alternative explanation for what he'd witnessed. But the evidence was undeniable. His wife was slowly poisoning his nephew, and she had an accomplice, someone she was romantically involved with, someone who was helping her plan whatever natural death they had in mind for Tommy. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he'd ever received. But beneath the pain, something else was growing, something cold and calculating and infinitely dangerous. Vince had spent his entire adult life protecting people from threats. Now he discovered that the greatest threat to his family was living under his own roof. As the sun rose over Maple Street, Vince began planning his response. He would not simply confront Patty or turn her over to the police. That would be too clean, too merciful for someone who had violated every sacred trust. Patty and her accomplice wanted to play games with innocent lives? Then Vince would show them what it meant to be a player in a game where the stakes were life and death, and where he held all the cards. Chapter 3. The Investigation. Vince spent the weekend in his basement workshop, ostensibly organizing his tools while actually planning the most important operation of his life. Above him, he could hear Patty reading Tommy bedtime stories, her voice soft and caring, the same voice that had coldly discussed the boy's natural death just days earlier. Monday morning, Vince implemented the first phase of his investigation. While Patty slept after her night shift, he carefully extracted a sample of the clear liquid from the bottle in her purse, using a syringe to draw out exactly 2 milliliters. His friend, Dr. Morgan Griffin, a toxicologist at the state lab, owed him several favors from Vince's military days. "I need this analyzed," Vince said, handing over the sealed vial during their lunch meeting. "Full spectrum, and I need the results kept completely confidential." Griffin, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, studied the sample with professional interest. "What am I looking for?" "Something that would cause fatigue, lethargy, and gradually declining health in a child. Something that wouldn't show up in a routine blood panel, but might cause organ failure over time." Griffin's expression darkened. "Vince, if this is what I think it is." "I need confirmation first," Vince interrupted. 48 hours? 24, Griffin promised. "And Vince? If this is what we both suspect, you'd better be ready to move fast." While waiting for the lab results, Vince focused on identifying Patty's accomplice. The phone number she called was registered to a prepaid account, but Vince had resources that went beyond normal civilian capabilities. A contact at the telecommunications company owed him a favor from a corporate espionage case, and by Wednesday afternoon, Vince had a location history for the phone. The pattern was revealing. The phone spent most of its time at an address in Riverside Heights, an upscale neighborhood 15 minutes from their home. Property records showed the house belonged to Dale Riverside, a 45-year-old insurance investigator who worked for Pinnacle Life Insurance Company. Insurance. Suddenly, pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place with sickening clarity. Vince spent Wednesday evening conducting surveillance on Riverside's house, using skills honed during countless military operations. The man himself was unremarkable. Average height, thinning brown hair, the soft physique of someone who spent his days behind a desk. But when Patty's car pulled into his driveway at 11:30 p.m., Vince felt the final piece of the puzzle slide into place. Through his telephoto lens, he watched his wife of 12 years kiss another man with a passion she hadn't shown him in months. They stood in Riverside's living room window, silhouetted against the light, and Vince could see Patty gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Even from a distance, her body language conveyed excitement, anticipation, the demeanor of someone discussing a plan nearing completion. Thursday morning brought confirmation from Griffin. It's insulin, the toxicologist reported grimly. High-grade pharmaceutical insulin in a non-diabetic child. Regular doses would cause exactly the symptoms you described. Lethargy, confusion, gradual organ stress. If the doses were increased over time, it would look like organ failure, Vince finished. Natural causes. The beauty of it from a murder standpoint is that insulin breaks down quickly in the body. Unless someone knew exactly what to test for within hours of administration, it would never be detected in an autopsy. Vince thanked Griffin and immediately began the next phase of his investigation. Using his security company's resources, he accessed Tommy's records with the state's social services department. What he found there made his hands clench into fists. 3 weeks before Mike and his wife had died in their car accident, someone had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy on Tommy. The beneficiary was listed as Patricia Murphy, his legal guardian. The policy had been purchased through Pinnacle Life Insurance Company, and the investigating agent who had approved the application was Dale Riverside. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Patty and Riverside hadn't simply stumbled into an affair. They had planned Tommy's murder before the boy had even come to live with them. They had been waiting for Mike and Linda to die, positioning themselves to profit from an 8-year-old's death. But there was more. Digging deeper into the insurance records, Vince discovered that the policy had specific clauses that would double the payout if Tommy died within the first year due to natural causes related to psychological trauma. Patty and Riverside had crafted the perfect crime. A grieving child, slowly dying from the stress of losing his parents, while his caring aunt documented every symptom for the insurance company. That evening, Vince sat in his study and began planning their destruction. He had considered simply killing them both. It would be easy enough to arrange accidents, and his military training had certainly prepared him for such actions. But death would be too quick, too merciful for what they had done. Instead, Vince decided to give them exactly what they wanted, Tommy's death. But the reality would be very different from their carefully crafted plan. He opened his laptop and began researching something that would have terrified Patty and Riverside if they'd known. Vincent Murphy had spent 2 years in Army intelligence, specializing in deep cover operations and psychological warfare. He knew how to make people destroy themselves, how to turn their own weapons against them, how to create scenarios where his enemies would beg for the mercy they denied others. Patty and Riverside thought they were playing a game with an innocent child's life. They had no idea they were about to become players in a much more dangerous game, one where Vince held all the cards, and where the only possible outcome was their complete annihilation. As he began drafting the first phase of his plan, Vince allowed himself a cold smile. By the time he was finished, Patty and Riverside would understand exactly what it felt like to be helpless, trapped, and slowly dying while someone they trusted watched without mercy. The game was about to begin. Chapter 4. The Architect of Vengeance. Friday morning, Vince called in sick to work, the first time he'd done so in 3 years. Instead of heading to his office, he drove to a storage unit facility across town, where he kept equipment that most security consultants would never need. The unit contained surveillance gear acquired through military surplus channels, communication equipment that operated on encrypted frequencies, and other tools that existed in the gray areas between civilian and military applications. More importantly, it contained detailed files on psychological operations techniques he'd learned during his time in Army intelligence. Vince had always been thorough in his record keeping, and now that methodical nature would serve him well. He spent the morning reviewing case studies in psychological manipulation, focusing specifically on operations designed to make targets destroy themselves. The key, he remembered from his training, was to create scenarios where the enemy's own actions led to their downfall. It wasn't enough to simply defeat them. They had to be made to defeat themselves. By noon, Vince had outlined a plan that would systematically dismantle Patty and Riverside's lives while giving them the illusion that they were succeeding. Phase 1 would begin immediately. That afternoon, while Patty was at work, Vince made several calls from untraceable phones. The first was to Pinnacle Life Insurance Company's Fraud Investigation Department. "I'd like to report suspicious activity regarding a life insurance policy," he told the investigator, disguising his voice with techniques learned in covert operations. "Policy number 7749 Alpha Delta on a minor named Thomas Murphy. The beneficiary appears to be administering unauthorized substances to the insured party." The investigator asked for details, and Vince provided just enough information to trigger an internal investigation without revealing his own involvement. Insurance companies, he knew, took fraud extremely seriously, especially when it involved the death of a child. His second call was to the state medical board's anonymous tip line. "I want to report a registered nurse who appears to be administering unprescribed medications to a child in her care. The nurse is Patricia Murphy, license number." He provided Patty's license information from memory, along with carefully worded descriptions of what he'd observed. The third call was to Dale Riverside supervisor at Pinnacle Life Insurance. Using a different voice disguise, Vince reported concerns about an investigator who might be approving fraudulent policies. He provided specific details about the timing of Tommy's policy and Riverside's role in its approval. Each call was designed to plant seeds of suspicion that would grow slowly, creating pressure on both Patty and Riverside without revealing the source of the investigation. They would assume it was random bad luck, never suspecting that their victim's guardian was orchestrating their downfall. That evening, Vince began implementing phase 2 of his plan. He needed Tommy to appear to decline more rapidly, but without actually harming the boy. The solution came from his medical contacts. A pharmacist friend owed him a favor and was willing to provide theatrical blood capsules and other harmless substances that could simulate serious symptoms. Over the weekend, while Patty worked her night shifts, Vince taught Tommy a game. "We're going to play a trick on Aunt Patty," he explained. "When she gives you your vitamins, I want you to bite down on this." He showed the boy the blood capsules. "It'll make fake blood come out of your mouth, like in the movies. Then you pretend to feel sick, and I'll come running. It's our secret game, okay?" Tommy, delighted to be included in what seemed like an elaborate prank, agreed enthusiastically. Vince felt a twinge of guilt at involving the boy, but reminded himself that Tommy was already being poisoned. This way, at least, the child would be protected while appearing to deteriorate. Monday morning brought the first fruits of Vince's psychological warfare. Patty received a call from the state medical board requesting an interview regarding her nursing practices. She handled it well, maintaining her composure, but Vince could see the stress in the way her hands shook as she hung up the phone. "What was that about?" he asked, feigning casual concern. "Just routine stuff," Patty replied, but her voice was slightly higher than normal. "Sometimes they do random audits of nurses who work with children. Nothing to worry about." That afternoon, while Patty was administering Tommy's vitamins, the boy bit down on the blood capsule as instructed. The effect was dramatic. Blood appeared to pour from his mouth as he collapsed, apparently unconscious. Patty's scream brought Vince running from his study. He found his wife kneeling beside Tommy, her face white with panic. "I don't know what happened," she gasped. "He was fine 1 second, and then—" Vince quickly determined that Tommy was breathing normally and his pulse was strong. The blood was already beginning to fade as the theatrical formula broke down. "We need to get him to the hospital," he announced. But as they prepared to leave, Tommy regained consciousness, claiming he felt fine except for a strange taste in his mouth. Vince insisted on a hospital visit anyway, where the emergency room doctors found nothing wrong, exactly as Vince had expected. The incident served multiple purposes. It escalated the apparent severity of Tommy's condition, which would accelerate whatever timeline Patty and Riverside were working with. More importantly, it created medical documentation of Tommy's deteriorating health, which would be crucial for the later phases of Vince's plan. That evening, Patty made another call to Riverside. "Something's happening faster than we expected," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Maybe we should reconsider the timeline." "Stay calm." Riverside's voice came through clearly on Vince's surveillance equipment. "These things happen with insulin. The body can become more sensitive over time. If anything, this confirms that our approach is working." "But what if Vince gets suspicious? He's already asking more questions about Tommy's health." Then we accelerate the plan. Another few weeks at most. The policy will pay out, and we can disappear together like we planned. Vince allowed himself a cold smile as he listened to their conversation. They thought they were adapting to unexpected complications, but they were actually dancing to his choreography. Every move they made brought them deeper into his trap. Phase 3 of his plan would begin tomorrow, and by the time it was complete, Patty and Riverside would find themselves in a position where their only choice would be to destroy each other. The puppet master was ready to make his pieces dance. Chapter 5. The Trap Tightens. Tuesday morning, Vince received a call that marked the beginning of his enemy's unraveling. The caller identified himself as Agent Reynolds from Pinnacle Life Insurance's Fraud Investigation Unit. Mr. Murphy, we've received some concerning information about your nephew's insurance policy. Would it be possible for us to schedule a meeting? Vince feigned confusion perfectly. I wasn't aware Tommy had an insurance policy. My wife handles most of the paperwork related to his care. I see. Would it be possible to speak with both of you together? Perhaps this afternoon. Vince agreed to a 3 p.m. meeting, then immediately called Patty at the hospital. Honey, we need to talk about Tommy's insurance. Someone from the company wants to meet with us today. The silence on the other end was telling. When Patty finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. I don't understand. What kind of meeting? Something about the policy you took out on him. I didn't even know you'd done that. It's just standard protection, Vincent. Given what happened to his parents, I thought it was responsible to make sure he'd be taken care of if anything happened to him while he's in our custody. It was a reasonable explanation, but Vince could hear the stress underneath her words. I'll pick you up at 2:30, he said. We'll handle this together. The meeting took place in the sterile conference room of Pinnacle Life Insurance. Agent Reynolds was a professional-looking woman in her 40s who laid out the situation with clinical precision. We've received allegations that the insured party may be receiving unauthorized medical treatments, she explained. As part of our investigation, we'll need to interview both of you separately, and we may require an independent medical examination of the child. Patty maintained her composure admirably, explaining her nursing background and her concern for Tommy's well-being. But Vince, trained to read micro-expressions and stress indicators, could see the fear in her eyes. More importantly, Agent Reynolds' questions revealed that someone had provided very specific information about the timing of the policy, the amounts involved, and the relationship between the beneficiary and the investigator who had approved it. Vince's anonymous tips were bearing fruit. After the meeting, Patty was quiet during the drive home. Vincent, she finally said, I need to tell you something about Dale Riverside. Vince's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice neutral. Who's Dale Riverside? He's the investigator who handled Tommy's policy. I knew him before. We worked together briefly at the hospital a few years ago, before he moved to insurance. When I applied for the policy, I mentioned that we'd work together, and he expedited the process. It was a masterful half-truth, acknowledging their connection while concealing its true nature. Should I be worried about a conflict of interest? Vince asked. No, it's nothing like that. But with this investigation, I'm worried they might try to make something out of our professional relationship. That evening, Vince watched through his surveillance system as Patty made an emergency call to Riverside. Her end of the conversation was frantic. They know about us. Not about us, but they know we have a connection. Someone's been feeding them information. Riverside's response, captured through sophisticated audio enhancement, was equally stressed. Who could know? We've been careful about everything. I don't know, but this can't be coincidence. First the medical board, now this. Someone's watching us. Maybe we should abort. Disappear before this gets worse. With what money? Patty snapped. We've invested everything in this plan. If we run now, we'll have nothing. Better nothing than prison. Just let me think. Maybe there's still a way to salvage this. Vince smiled as he listened to their growing panic. Phase 4 of his plan would push them past the breaking point. Wednesday morning, Vince made another series of untraceable calls. The first was to the Drug Enforcement Administration's tip line, reporting suspicious acquisition of pharmaceutical-grade insulin by a nurse with access to hospital supplies. The second was to Riverside's ex-wife, a piece of information Vince had uncovered during his background research. Mrs. Riverside, this is Detective Johnson with the Insurance Fraud Unit. We're investigating your ex-husband's activities at Pinnacle Life Insurance. I wonder if we could discuss his financial situation during your divorce proceedings? The woman was eager to cooperate, apparently harboring significant resentment toward her ex-husband. She provided details about hidden assets, falsified financial statements during their divorce, and Dale's history of cutting ethical corners to close deals. By afternoon, both Patty and Riverside were receiving calls from multiple agencies. The pressure was mounting exponentially, and their carefully constructed plan was collapsing around them. That evening, Tommy performed his blood capsule trick again, this time during dinner. The timing was perfect. Patty had just administered his vitamins when he suddenly clutched his stomach and blood began pouring from his mouth. This time, Vince called 911. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Vince sat in the back with Tommy, holding his hand while the boy continued his performance, all while watching Patty's face crumble with each passing minute. At the hospital, emergency room doctors ran extensive tests while Vince maintained his role as the concerned guardian. Dr. Sarah Chun, the attending physician, pulled him aside for a private conversation. Mr. Murphy, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Has Tommy been in contact with any medications that you're aware of? Specifically, has anyone been giving him anything that wasn't prescribed? Vince's heart rate accelerated, but not from fear, from anticipation. What kind of medications? We found trace amounts of insulin in his blood work. In a non-diabetic child, that's extremely concerning. Insulin in the wrong dosage can cause exactly the symptoms you've described: lethargy, confusion, and in extreme cases, seizures or coma. Insulin? How would he get insulin? Dr. Chin's expression was grave. That's what we need to determine. I'm required to report this to Child Protective Services and the police. Someone has been administering insulin to your nephew, and at this point, we have to consider it attempted murder. As if on cue, Patty appeared in the hallway outside the consultation room. Through the glass window, Vince could see her face go white as she overheard Dr. Chen's words. The trap had snapped shut. In a few hours, police would be asking questions that Patty couldn't answer without implicating herself. Her only choice would be to throw Riverside under the bus, claiming he had somehow coerced her into the scheme. But Vince had anticipated that move. Phase 5 of his plan would ensure that when Patty tried to betray her partner, she would find that Riverside had already betrayed her. The final act of their destruction was about to begin. Chapter 6: The Betrayal. Thursday morning brought chaos to the Murphy household. 2 detectives arrived at 7 a.m., followed by a Child Protective Services investigator, followed by Agent Reynolds from the insurance company. Tommy, coached by Vince, played his part perfectly, a confused, frightened child who didn't understand why adults were asking so many questions. Patty handled the initial questioning with admirable composure, maintaining her story about Tommy's declining health being related to grief and trauma. But when Detective Morrison, a sharp-eyed woman with 20 years of experience, began asking specific questions about insulin, Patty's facade began to crack. Mrs. Murphy, as a registered nurse, you have access to pharmaceutical-grade insulin at the hospital where you work. Is that correct? Yes, but I would never. I've never taken anything from the hospital. Everything is strictly monitored. We're not suggesting you stole anything, Detective Morrison said calmly. But insulin can be obtained through legitimate prescriptions, even for non-diabetic patients, if someone knows how to work the system. Vince watched his wife's face carefully, noting the micro-expressions that revealed her growing panic. She was beginning to realize that her medical knowledge, which she'd thought would protect her, was actually incriminating her. The interview continued for 2 hours, with the detectives asking increasingly specific questions about Tommy's daily routine, his diet, and who had access to his food and drinks. By the end, Patty was visibly shaken. After the police left, Vince found his wife sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. "This is insane," she said. "They think I'm poisoning Tommy. My own nephew." "I know, honey," Vince replied, playing his role perfectly. "But the truth will come out. If someone's been giving him insulin, they'll find out who. What if they don't believe me? What if they think my medical background makes me the obvious suspect? Vince sat beside her, taking her hands in his. Patty, is there anything you haven't told me? Anything at all? Because now is the time to be completely honest. For a moment, he thought she might confess everything. Her face went through a series of emotions: fear, guilt, calculation. But in the end, her survival instincts won out. No, she said firmly. There's nothing to tell. I've done everything I can to help Tommy recover from his trauma. Meanwhile, across town, Dale Riverside was having his own crisis. Vince's carefully orchestrated pressure campaign had triggered multiple investigations, and Riverside's supervisor had placed him on administrative leave pending a full review of his recent cases. That afternoon, Vince received a call that confirmed his enemies were beginning to turn on each other. The caller was Riverside, though the man didn't know he was speaking to his target. Mr. Murphy? This is Dale Riverside from Pinnacle Life Insurance. I need to speak with you urgently about your nephew's policy. Of course, Vince replied. How can I help? I think there may be some information about your wife that you need to know. Information that could be relevant to the current investigation. They arranged to meet at a coffee shop downtown, away from both their homes. Vince arrived early, positioning himself to observe Riverside's behavior before making contact. The insurance investigator looked haggard, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his hands shaking as he drank coffee. When Vince introduced himself, Riverside's relief was palpable. Mr. Murphy, I want you to know that I tried to prevent this situation, but your wife, she could be very persuasive. Vince maintained an expression of confused concern. I'm not sure I understand. The insurance policy on your nephew. Patricia approached me months ago, before the boy even came to live with you. She said she wanted to make sure he'd be protected financially if anything happened to him. But the way she talked about it, she seemed almost eager for something to happen. It was a masterful betrayal, designed to save Riverside's own skin by painting Patty as the mastermind. She specifically asked about policies that would pay out for natural deaths caused by medical conditions. She said she was concerned about Tommy's mental health, that children who lose their parents sometimes give up. Are you suggesting my wife planned for Tommy to die? Vince asked, injecting just the right amount of shock into his voice. I'm saying she seemed to know more about insurance payouts for childhood deaths than most people would. And when I processed the policy, she insisted on specific clauses that would maximize the payout if the child died within the first year. Riverside leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Mr. Murphy, I think your wife may have been planning this for a long time. The timing of everything, the way she handled the application, the specific questions she asked. I should have reported it then, but she convinced me she was just being thorough. It was exactly the betrayal Vince had orchestrated. By making Riverside believe that suspicion was closing in on him, he'd motivated the man to throw Patty under the bus to save himself. Now all Vince had to do was guide that betrayal in the right direction. If you suspected something, why didn't you report it? Vince asked. Riverside's face flushed. Patricia and I had worked together before. At the hospital, we had a professional relationship, and I thought I might be misreading the situation. But now, with the police investigation and the evidence of insulin poisoning, you think my wife has been poisoning Tommy? I think she's capable of it, Riverside said. And I think I may have inadvertently helped her by approving a policy that would reward her for it. That evening, Vince shared the conversation with Patty, carefully omitting any mention of his role in arranging it. As he spoke, he watched his wife's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, cold calculation. He's lying, she said flatly. He's trying to save himself by blaming me. But why would he lie about something so specific? Because he's the one who suggested the insurance policy in the first place. He approached me at the hospital, said he could set up something that would protect Tommy financially. I was grieving for my brother-in-law, not thinking clearly, and he took advantage of that. It was a quick recovery, but Vince could see the desperation in her eyes. Patty was realizing that her carefully constructed plan was collapsing, and her only hope was to destroy Riverside before he could destroy her. Vincent, she said, reaching for his hands, I think Dale has been manipulating this whole situation. What if he's the one who's been giving Tommy insulin? What if he's been coming to the house when I'm at work, The accusation was absurd. Riverside had never been to their house, and Vince's surveillance would have captured any such visits. But he could see the logic from Patty's perspective. Frame Riverside for the poisoning while portraying herself as another victim of his manipulation. "We need to tell the police about this," Vince said, playing his role perfectly. "Yes," Patty agreed, her voice growing stronger as she convinced herself of her new story. "We need to tell them everything about Dale's behavior, his suggestions about the insurance policy, his access to insulin through his work connections." As his wife began constructing her web of lies, Vince felt a cold satisfaction. Tomorrow, he would implement the final phase of his plan, the phase that would ensure both of his enemies destroyed themselves completely while believing they were destroying each other. The endgame was about to begin. Chapter 7, The Final Gambit. Friday morning, Vince made the most important call of his campaign. Using voice alteration technology, he contacted both Patty and Riverside simultaneously, setting up a conference call that neither knew the other was on. "This is Detective Morrison," he said, perfectly mimicking the police detective's voice patterns. "We've completed our analysis of the evidence, and we need both of you to come in immediately. The district attorney is preparing charges, and we're offering one chance for cooperation before arrests are made." The response was immediate chaos. Both Patty and Riverside began talking at once, each trying to explain their innocence while inadvertently revealing their guilt. More importantly, each could hear the other's voice, realizing they were both on the call. "Dale." Patty's voice was sharp with betrayal. "What are you doing on this call?" "Patricia? I thought," the detective said, "I was the only one." Vince had anticipated this moment, and he guided the conversation expertly. "Both of you are suspects in the attempted murder of Thomas Murphy. We have evidence of insulin poisoning, evidence of insurance fraud, and evidence of conspiracy. One of you is going to prison for attempted murder. The other might get a lighter sentence for cooperation." The silence that followed was electric with tension. Vince could almost hear their thoughts racing, each calculating how to save themselves by destroying the other. "Detective," Riverside said carefully, "I told Mr. Murphy yesterday about Patricia's suspicious behavior regarding the insurance policy. I have documentation of her requests, her specific questions about childhood death benefits." "You bastard," Patty exploded. "You were the one who suggested the whole thing. You came to me with the plan. That's a lie, and you know it. I have emails from you, Patricia, messages where you talked about solving the Tommy problem permanently." Vince's heart raced as he listened to them destroy each other. There were no such emails. He would have found them during his surveillance. But in their panic, they were both willing to claim evidence that didn't exist. "I want immunity," Patty said suddenly. "Complete immunity, and I'll tell you everything about Dale's plan. She doesn't get to make deals." Riverside shouted, "I'm the one who contacted Mr. Murphy yesterday. I'm the one who's been cooperating." Vince let them argue for several more minutes, each accusation becoming more desperate and more damaging. Then he delivered the killing blow. "We're terminating this call," he said in the detective's voice. "Both of you will be arrested within the hour. If either of you wants to make a deal, you'll need to provide concrete evidence against the other. Documentation, recordings, physical proof. Accusations aren't enough." After ending the call, Vince sat back and waited. His surveillance equipment would capture everything that happened next, and he was confident that his enemies would provide exactly the evidence he needed to destroy them both. He didn't have to wait long. Within 30 minutes, Patty was tearing through the house, searching for anything that might implicate Riverside. She found a bottle of insulin hidden in her purse and immediately drove to Riverside's house. Vince followed at a distance, watching through telephoto lenses as his wife pounded on Riverside's door. When he answered, their confrontation was visible through his living room window. "You son of a bitch," Patty screamed, holding up the insulin bottle. "This is your insurance policy. I'm giving this to the police and telling them you planted it in my purse. That's your insulin, Patricia. You're the nurse. You're the one with access." "Not anymore. I quit my job this morning and told them you've been pressuring me to steal medical supplies for you." Riverside's face went white. "You did what?" I told them you were running some kind of medical fraud scheme using stolen insulin and forged prescriptions. I have recordings of our conversations where you told me how to acquire it. But Riverside had his own nuclear option. You want to play recordings? I've been recording everything since this started. I have hours of you talking about killing Tommy, about collecting the insurance money, about how we could be together once the little problem was solved. Liar. Want to hear it? Riverside pulled out his phone and played an audio file. Patty's voice came through clearly. When it's over, when Tommy's gone, we'll have $500,000 and no one to answer to. The recording was fabricated. Vince could tell from the audio compression artifacts, but Patty couldn't. Her face crumpled as she realized that Riverside had been planning to betray her from the beginning. You were recording me, she whispered. This whole time, you were setting me up. Just like you were setting me up with your fake emails and your lies to the police. The argument escalated quickly. Through his lenses, Vince watched Patty raise the insulin bottle like a weapon, threatening to smash it over Riverside's head. They struggled briefly, and the bottle shattered against the hardwood floor. Now we both go down, Patty snarled. No evidence, no insurance money, no escape plan. We're both destroyed. But she was wrong. Vince had collected all the evidence he needed, and more importantly, he had recorded their entire confrontation. Two people confessing to conspiracy, attempted murder, and insurance fraud while destroying each other in the process. As sirens approached, someone had called the police about the disturbance. Vince drove home to prepare for the final act of his revenge. Tomorrow, Detective Morrison would receive an anonymous package containing video footage, audio recordings, and documentation of the entire conspiracy. The evidence would be overwhelming and undeniable. More importantly, both Patty and Riverside would be arrested with nothing but accusations against each other. Their mutual betrayal had eliminated any possibility of cooperation or shared defense. They would go to trial separately, each trying to prove the other's guilt, each providing testimony that would ensure both their convictions. That evening, Vince sat in his study and reviewed the fruits of his campaign. In 3 weeks, he had systematically destroyed 2 people who had planned to murder an innocent child for money. They had been defeated not by superior force, but by their own greed, their own willingness to betray anyone for personal gain. Tommy was safe, the insurance money would never be paid, and justice would be served. But more than that, Vince had proved something to himself. That betrayal would always carry a price, and that he was capable of collecting that debt with interest. The game was nearly over. Only the final moves remained. Chapter 8, The Reckoning. Saturday morning, Detective Morrison received an unmarked package at the police station. Inside, she found a USB drive containing over 40 hours of surveillance footage, detailed financial records, and audio recordings that documented the entire conspiracy against Tommy Murphy. The evidence was so comprehensive that the district attorney's office moved immediately. By noon, arrest warrants had been issued for both Patricia Murphy and Dale Riverside on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and child endangerment. Patty was arrested at home, where she had been packing hastily, apparently planning to flee. The arresting officers found her with $15,000 in cash and a plane ticket to Costa Rica, evidence that suggested she had escape plans independent of Riverside. Riverside was arrested at his office, where he had been attempting to destroy documents related to Tommy's insurance policy. Security cameras captured him feeding papers into a shredder, providing additional evidence of obstruction of justice. By Saturday evening, both were in custody, each believing the other had provided the evidence that led to their arrests. Vince spent the weekend playing the role of the shocked husband and guardian. He met with police investigators, insurance representatives, and child protective services workers, all while maintaining perfect innocence. His performance was flawless, a man betrayed by his wife, confused by the revelation of her crimes, focused only on protecting his nephew's well-being. "I can't believe Patricia was capable of this," he told Detective Morrison during his formal interview. "I trusted her completely. We both love Tommy like our own son." "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we know least," Morrison replied. "The evidence suggests this conspiracy began months before Tommy came to live with you. Your wife and Mr. Riverside were planning this before his parents even died. The implication was staggering. Vince had suspected that Patty and Riverside were opportunists who had seized on Tommy's tragedy, but the evidence suggested something far more sinister. They had been waiting for Mike and Linda to die, positioning themselves to profit from the orphan child's death. Monday brought the first court appearances. Vince attended both hearings, sitting in the gallery like any other concerned family member. He watched with cold satisfaction as Patty and Riverside were brought in separately, each looking haggard and desperate after their weekend in jail. During Patty's arraignment, her court-appointed attorney tried to argue for bail, claiming she was a respected nurse with no criminal history and strong ties to the community. But the prosecutor presented evidence of her flight preparations and the severity of the charges against her. Bail was denied. Riverside's hearing was equally damaging. The prosecutor revealed that he had been under investigation by multiple agencies for insurance fraud, and that the case against Tommy represented a pattern of suspicious policies he had approved. His attorney's request for bail was also denied. Outside the courthouse, Vince was approached by a reporter from the local news station. "Mr. Murphy, how does it feel to know that your wife was allegedly poisoning your nephew?" "It feels like a nightmare," Vince replied, his voice heavy with apparent grief. "I trusted Patricia with Tommy's life. I can't imagine how someone could hurt an innocent child who had already lost so much." The interview aired that evening, reinforcing Vince's image as another victim of the conspiracy. The story gained national attention. A grieving child slowly poisoned by his caregiver, while she and her lover waited to collect insurance money. Public opinion was overwhelmingly sympathetic to Vince and Tommy, while condemnation of Patty and Riverside was swift and merciless. Over the following weeks, more details emerged during the legal proceedings. The prosecution revealed that Patty had been administering insulin to Tommy for over a month, carefully escalating the doses to simulate a natural decline. Riverside had helped her structure the insurance policy to maximize the payout while minimizing suspicion. But the most damaging evidence came from their own recorded conversations, the mutual betrayals and accusations that Vince had orchestrated during his fake police call. Both Patty and Riverside had made statements that could only be interpreted as confessions, and their attempts to blame each other had eliminated any possibility of claiming innocence. Patty's defense team tried to argue that she had been manipulated by Riverside, that her nursing background had been exploited by a sophisticated insurance fraud expert. But the evidence showed that she had been an active and willing participant, someone who had taken out the policy before Tommy had even come to live with them. Riverside's attorneys took the opposite approach, claiming that Patty had seduced him into the scheme, using their romantic relationship to manipulate him into approving a fraudulent policy. But financial records showed that he had profited significantly from similar questionable policies in the past, suggesting a pattern of criminal behavior. The media coverage intensified as the trials approached. Tommy's story became a symbol of child endangerment and insurance fraud, while Vince was portrayed as a heroic guardian who had saved his nephew from certain death. Interview requests poured in, but Vince declined them all, claiming he wanted to focus on Tommy's recovery and healing. In private, however, Vince was already planning the next phase of his life. He had liquidated most of their shared assets before Patty's arrest, ensuring that her legal defense would be poorly funded. He had also begun the process of adopting Tommy officially, removing any remaining legal connection between the boy and his attempted murderer. Most importantly, he had started a new business venture, a security consulting firm that specialized in personal protection and threat assessment. His reputation as someone who had uncovered and stopped a conspiracy against his own family would be invaluable in attracting clients who needed similar protection. As the trial dates approached, Vince reflected on what he had accomplished. He had saved Tommy's life, destroyed two people who had planned to murder a child for money, and positioned himself to profit from the experience. He had proven that betrayal would always carry a price, and that he was capable of exacting that price with surgical precision. The final act of justice was about to begin, and Vince would be there to watch his enemies face the consequences of their choices. Chapter 9. Justice Served. The trials began 6 months after the arrests, with Patty and Riverside being prosecuted separately to prevent any coordination in their defenses. Vince attended every day, sitting in the front row of the gallery, playing the role of the grieving husband and protective guardian. Patty's trial came first. Her defense attorney, overwhelmed by the evidence and working with limited resources due to Vince's careful financial maneuvering, tried to paint her as a victim of Riverside's manipulation. But the prosecution's case was devastating. They presented the surveillance footage showing Patty administering insulin to Tommy, the audio recordings of her conversations with Riverside about the insurance policy, and the financial records proving she had taken out the policy before Tommy had even come to live with them. Most damaging of all were her own words during the confrontation at Riverside's house, recorded by Vince's surveillance equipment. "When it's over, when Tommy's gone, we'll have $500,000 and no one to answer to." The prosecutor played back Patty's voice to the jury. "These are not the words of someone being manipulated. These are the words of someone planning the murder of an 8-year-old child." Tommy testified via closed-circuit television, his innocence and vulnerability providing a stark contrast to the calculating cruelty of the defendants. He described feeling sick after taking his vitamins, the strange taste in his mouth, and the way he would become sleepy and confused. "Aunt Patty said the vitamins would make me big and strong like Uncle Vince," Tommy told the court, his small voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "But they made me feel bad instead." Vince was called as a witness for the prosecution, and his testimony was masterful. He described his growing concerns about Tommy's health, his decision to install surveillance cameras to monitor the boy's care, and his shock at discovering his wife's betrayal. "I trusted Patricia completely," he said, his voice breaking convincingly. "She was a registered nurse, a professional caregiver. I never imagined she could hurt a child who had already lost everything." When Patty's attorney cross-examined him, trying to suggest that Vince might have known about the insurance policy, his response was devastating. "If I had known my wife was planning to murder my nephew for money, I would have turned her in to the police immediately. No amount of money is worth a child's life." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, and child endangerment. Patty's sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Riverside's trial followed a similar pattern, but with an additional element of desperation. His attorney had tried to negotiate a plea bargain, but the prosecution, bolstered by public outrage and overwhelming evidence, refused to consider anything less than full accountability. The evidence against Riverside was equally damning. Financial records showed he had profited from suspicious insurance policies for years, suggesting Tommy's case was part of a larger pattern of fraud. Email records revealed he had researched the timing of insurance payouts for childhood deaths and the medical conditions that would trigger maximum benefits. Most damaging were the recorded conversations where he discussed accelerating the timeline for Tommy's death and his detailed knowledge of how insulin could be used to cause gradual organ failure in a child. When Riverside took the stand in his own defense, his attorney tried to portray him as someone who had been seduced into the scheme by Patty's medical expertise and romantic manipulation. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor demolished this narrative. "Mr. Riverside, you are an insurance investigator with 15 years of experience. Are you telling this jury that you didn't recognize the signs of insurance fraud when you approved a $500,000 policy on a child whose parents had just died?" Patricia convinced me it was legitimate. And when she asked specific questions about policies that would pay double for deaths caused by natural medical conditions, that didn't raise any red flags. She said she was just being thorough. "Mr. Riverside, how many legitimate policies have you approved where the beneficiary researched the specific circumstances that would maximize the payout before the insured party even came into their custody?" Riverside had no answer. His conviction was even swifter than Patty's. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before finding him guilty on all charges. The sentencing hearings were held on the same day, creating a media spectacle that drew national attention. Vince had prepared a victim impact statement that was both heartbreaking and damning. "Tommy Murphy is 8 years old," he began, his voice steady but filled with controlled emotion. "He had already lost his parents in a tragic accident when he came to live with us. He trusted the adults in his life to protect him, to care for him, to help him heal from his trauma. Instead, my wife and her accomplice saw him as an opportunity for profit. They planned his death before he even moved into our home. They took out an insurance policy on his life and then began slowly poisoning him, documenting his decline to support their eventual claim. Tommy will carry the scars of this betrayal for the rest of his life. He trusted his aunt to care for him, and she fed him poison. He trusted the system to protect him, and an insurance investigator tried to profit from his death. I asked this court to impose the maximum sentence allowed by law. These defendants showed no mercy to an innocent child. They deserve none in return. Judge Harrison, a stern woman with 30 years on the bench, was clearly moved by Vince's statement and disgusted by the defendant's crimes. Her sentencing was swift and merciless. Patricia Murphy received 25 years to life for attempted murder, with additional sentences for conspiracy and fraud to be served concurrently. She would not be eligible for parole for 20 years. Dale Riverside received 22 years to life, with similar restrictions on parole eligibility. Additionally, he was ordered to pay restitution to the insurance company and faced federal charges for mail fraud that could add additional years to his sentence. As the defendants were led away in shackles, Vince felt a profound sense of completion. The people who had planned to murder Tommy for money would spend the rest of their productive lives in prison. Justice had been served, and the price of betrayal had been paid in full. Outside the courthouse, Vince was approached by reporters seeking comment on the sentences. His response was measured and appropriate. No sentence can undo the harm that was done to Tommy, but I hope these convictions send a message that children will be protected and that those who prey on the innocent will face the full consequences of their actions. That evening, Vince returned home to find Tommy playing in the backyard, laughing and running with the energy of a healthy 8-year-old. The boy's recovery had been complete once the insulin poisoning stopped, and with proper therapy, he was beginning to heal from the psychological trauma as well. "Uncle Vince," Tommy called out, running over with a big smile. "Mrs. Henderson taught me how to throw a curveball. Want to see?" As Vince played catch with his nephew in the fading daylight, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. He had discovered betrayal in his own home, planned and executed a campaign of psychological warfare against his enemies, and seen justice served to those who had planned to murder an innocent child. Some might question his methods, but Vince felt no remorse. He had protected the innocent and punished the guilty. He had proven that betrayal would always carry a price, and that he was capable of collecting that debt with interest. Most importantly, Tommy was safe, healthy, and beginning to heal. The boy would grow up knowing that his uncle had moved heaven and earth to protect him, that some people in this world could be trusted completely, and that justice would always prevail in the end. As they walked back toward the house, Tommy slipped his hand into Vince's. "Uncle Vince?"